Good morning, everyone. Nicholas Jacobson here, bringing you episode 2 of our family history of war, where I'm talking about my own personal family history of my grandfather, Richard Jacobson, who was a part of the 486 Bombardier Group and flew B-17 bombers into Germany. Today we're going to talk about his very first mission, which today, being August 7th, it was August 7th, 1944. Their target was and I'm sure I'm going to butcher this name, Jussy or Jussy Bridge in France, near a town named St. Quentin. So we're going to talk about that today. Here's again a photo from last episode that you saw, him and his crew in front of the 5 Grand itself. This was actually probably one of the photos they took right before one of their missions. It was pretty common for them to take photographs of a crew before they flew. And this one of the ones I do have, which I don't have all of them, this one is not dated, so I do not know whether or not if this was or wasn't at that time. But you can take note of their attire. They seem to have their shirts uncuffed. It is definitely a brighter day, probably a much warmer day before this photo was taken, where they were at. Most of the other photos I have were clearly marked to be in the winter, and they're all wearing jackets and sweaters. So very possible this is one of those photos from one of their first missions. Now, before I start talking about their actual mission, we should get a sense of what was going on at the time. Now, this map depicts a very specific portion of, you got the Straits of Dover here. This is the southeast corner of England. This being kind of actually more of the northern, slight eastern, northeastern portion of France. And at this point in the war, in August, it was only 2 months previous, on June 6th, that we had our landing at Normandy. So right now we're looking at the Allied forces being on the offensive, German forces on the retreat. And so our planes started having more and more what we call air superiority, where they were in control of airways, pushing further and further into mainland Europe. And that allowed them to conduct deeper and deeper bombing missions and bombing raids with aircraft. So this particular mission, they actually traveled all the way into this place right here, St. Quentin. And again, I'm probably butchering these names. There was a bridge here, which would have been the Jussy or Jussy, whoever is very fluent in French, if they could correct me on how to pronounce that. But it's a pretty vital bridge, and it was one where, even if you just look at the map, you can see it connected a canal system near a major waterway system next to a rail system. So it was a pretty important bridge for them to target. Among all the bridges were, but this one was most likely targeted for, I can only guess, I don't know why specifically, but my guess was to deny supplies and reinforcements from being brought in from Germany through northern France back into the main part of the country, and also potentially to even deny the enemy from being able to retreat, cross through these locations, and be able to regroup and be redeployable back from Germany. So it was one of those two possible outcomes, is what I would most likely assume was what their primary mission was. But again, at this point in time, the Germans, they were on the retreat, and we were trying to quickly advance to cover as much ground as possible and try to push the Nazis back into Germany's traditional lines of their country outside of France. On the other side, at the same time, to keep an eye and an understanding of why we see what we see when we're going through what was documented for his missions. In Russia, the Russian line was very quickly advancing to Germany. So we were very much pinching in on Germany. And as evidence of this, I have a letter that was actually written on August 1st, so just that week before his first mission, where my grandfather wrote to my great-grandfather. It says, "Dear Dad, as you can see my address," I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. "Address, I have been assigned to the bombardment group. This is a pretty nice base and I can't complain. Of course, I wish I were back in the States. I really appreciate home more than ever now. Things are moving pretty fast over here, so you've probably been reading in the papers. Say, those Russians, the way they are moving, will have this war over before too long, I hope." And he continues on his letter, but as he notes, like, we knew the Russians were advancing very quickly too. So let's get in to what actually happened to him on his first mission. Now, this is not from their mission, this is from another mission, but this would help paint the picture. They would have been briefed that morning, maybe even the night before, depending on what time the mission was, and I don't have an exact time on the mission. Most likely the mission happened during the day because they had to positively identify their targets. And night vision devices were not really a thing at that time. At least they weren't being used if they were. And so most likely the mission took place during the day. Now they may have left early in the morning though, I'm not sure, but they would have been briefed on a map, similar to the one you see back here, which is what you see depicted in this photo. And they would have had different routes entering in and potentially multiple targets. And so within the entirety of the bombardier group, there may have been multiple avenues out, and you even note sometimes they didn't always leave from the same place or return to the same place. This particular route, and this was dated, the handwritten date says 7/14, so that would have been, 3 weeks previous. Whoever's route and whatever targets were at this, they started out of the southern portion of France, near New Haven area. They would have flown across the straits and then returned all the way back into, as you can see, northern portion of France, or England rather. So they would have been briefed, they would have been given a warning and told to be on standby. There were many times that they would go on standby and they would be called off because of bad weather, because of cloud cover. They had to constantly be prepared to adjust to circumstances. So once they were put on a waiting group, they were basically hanging out, waiting for their opportunity. So here I'm going to read to you. Again, here's St. Quentin right here. I'm moving this all the way back. This is where their target was. And this comes from that document I shared with you before. That was written by John McBride, talking about their different combat missions. Here's number 1. St. Quentin, France. Again, the target being the Jussy Bridge. Clouds prevented us from dropping our bombs over the target. See, a very common issue. They had difficulty because of cloud cover. So what would they do? They would circle. We circled around looking for another spot to bomb. Identify other targets, drop your load. But failed to find any break in the clouds to locate a second target. So there's no way they could see where they were going, where they were dropping. All the planes returned to the base with their bomb load, and as a result, Unger put this kind of a weird space here, put a smooth spot on the tires due to the sudden applying of brakes after hitting the runway. So you got to imagine these planes, when they were made, they were very thinly built. We quickly slapped them together. They really are almost like glorified paper airplanes. Very thin metal. In many cases, sometimes it was even more of a, what would you call that? A polymer that was applied to some tarp. And so it was basically like a paper mache in a glorified way. And so the planes themselves are very light. And you start loading it with these bombs. And one of these days I'll have a photo somewhere of one of the bombs and what they look like compared to a person standing next to it. But these bombs, when loaded in, would weigh that plane down. That was the hugest portion of the weight of the plane, fuel and bombs. So most of their landings, and the design was with the intent that they wouldn't be carrying a full load on the way home, and that they would make it home, much lighter. Well, obviously they came back with their full loads, and they ended up putting a smooth spot on the tires due to sudden planar bricks. So I bet it was a pretty rough, pretty hard landing, and probably feeling a little sketchy since you're sitting on top of a whole bunch of explosives. No enemy fighters were sighted. Part of this may have been because of the different battles that are happening on both fronts at that moment. There was a series of campaigns on the United States and Allied side taking place near, I'm not sure if I can pronounce this one, Caen or Caen, Caen, France. And you can't see it on this map, but they were pushing their way throughout the month of August, start pushing and encircling many different groups of Germans and trying to force them to surrender. But since enemy flak guns had fired at us, so no enemy fires were sighted, but since enemy flak guns were fired at us, it was considered a mission. Most of us were frightened and wore our flak suits and helmets the entire time. So I take it there was times when they would dress down before getting into certain areas, but this would be the first mission. They gave them a little bit what we call the pucker effect. I'm sure you can translate yourself as to what that means, but here's one of the men on the crew, Sergeant Boyce, who's a radio man, made comical sketches, and he made this one of both my grandfather and Captain Unger. But you can guess my grandfather being a little guy, that's my grandfather right there, tucked up in his own helmet, probably freaked out a lot. He says, "Jake, don't look at that flak. Fly this plane." So there's probably lots of jokes they made with each other. He did this same depiction in a couple different ways, a couple different times. Again, you have switched seats, but here you have my grandfather all tucked up. And you got the pilot, at the time Lieutenant Unger, in the captain's seat. So whenever you're under high stress, jokes and stuff like that happen frequently. It's a way of decompressing. But they didn't ever hit their target. So while this was a vital bridge, they never hit that target, and they did not go back to that location the next day. We will be talking about the location that they did go the next day, which was Saint Sylvain, France, near Caen. I'm going to mispronounce it over and over. But this happened the next day, so tomorrow I'm going to do another post. I'm going to talk about what happened then, because that's more details about that battle that was taking place.